Hi, I'm Tom Radcliffe. I'm the Director of Engineering at Active State Software, and it's my pleasure to be here talking to a room full of people, every single one of whom knows more about Perl than I do. So, who am I? I'm a physicist by education. I dropped out of academia during the dot-com boom when they would hire anybody who was warm and breathing and could write a little code. And in 2016, I was one of about 1,400 physicists who were honored with the 2016 Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics for work on neutrino physics. I was a postdoc with the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory in the 1990s, working on detector simulation, calibration, building radiation sources for detector calibration, and writing code to move, drive the robotic manipulator to move sources around the detector. And the SNO results, combined with results from other neutrino detectors around the world, demonstrated that neutrinos have mass, which was one of the big open questions in physics in the 20th century. I am a lapsed Perl person. One of my first jobs in the commercial world was on an application called GeneLinker, which was a desktop data analysis tool for genomics. That had an embedded Perl engine for user scripting, and I was doing a lot of Perl at the time. The Perl was the only scripting language that I kind of allowed people to use in the company. I wanted us all focused on Perl because it did everything and it did it very easily. We didn't need half a dozen little languages. We just needed Perl. Around about 2005, for one reason or another, I moved into doing more Python, partly because the Perl native object system was too complicated for me and I didn't understand it, and have spent most of the time since doing embedded C algorithm development for medical imaging, for computer-assisted surgery, and some prototyping in Python. But I haven't really looked at Perl literally in about 10 years, until I joined Active State in August of, or July of 2015. So I haven't been with the company for quite a year. I am the director of engineering there, and I'll talk a little bit about all the things the company does. Active State, as many of you probably know, has been around for a long time in the Perl world. It was originally founded to supply Perl on Windows in 1997, when Perl on Windows was really hard to do. It has gone through a number of iterations that I will talk about. We currently support everything from 5.8 to 5.24 on a huge range of hardware. And we are an enterprise support company, basically. We sell Perl to the enterprise, and there are a lot of large organizations in the world running a lot of Perl on really old hardware. I have this vision of some of our large customers having sort of Indiana Jones style warehouses full of AIX and HPUX boxes, all of which are running Perl jobs. So if anybody wants 32-bit, 510 on HPUX on Itanium, we actually ship that to some of our enterprise customers. I sometimes really wonder what they're doing with it, and other times I'm not sure I really want to know. In the early 2000s, Active State was bought because they had written a spam filter in Perl that was really good, and you could get bought for a spam filter back in those days. The acquirer didn't really want the core languages. They wanted the spam filter, so they spun the language part of the company back out. And so that was Active State 1.0, which became what we think of as Active State 2.0, which continued to ship Active Perl, added Active Python and Active Tcl, tool command language. We also have Komodo IDE, which is a development tool, and a Tcl dev kit and a Perl dev kit. Perl dev kit has got a debugger, it has app wrapping, it has a whole bunch of features. That iteration of the company decided to build a private platform as a service. I'm not totally sure what that means, called Staccato, which was very successful and was bought by Hewlett-Packard in August of 2015, which sounds like it was a month after I joined the company. It was actually about 3 days. I joined July 28th. The Staccato unit was sold August 3rd. So I had to come up to speed very quickly because some of our senior people went with the sale. And it's been a very exciting year moving the company forward since that time. And things have settled down now. We're shipping the languages that we have always shipped. We're shipping the development tools. Komodo 10 has just been released with all kinds of awesome new features. And we are looking around and asking, okay, if this is Active State 3.0, what are we going to do next? I'm mostly a Python guy, so I came into the company thinking, well, Python is cool. Python is the future. And I started looking at what our customers were doing and how they were doing it, and I realized that maybe I should have been paying attention to Perl a little more for the last decade. So part of this talk is sort of Tom's Perl revelation, that I think there are probably a lot of people out there like me who, for one reason or another, drifted away from Perl 10 years ago, who now we have a great opportunity to entice back. I think it's a very exciting time for the language, and I've started to think about this as the Perl Renaissance, which I've almost heard those words out of people's mouths. If nobody else has said them, they've said things very close to that. And I think that the data that I'll show really validates that reality, that we are in the midst of a Perl Renaissance, which is not at all what I was expecting when I wrote the abstract for this talk, for example. So things are gonna wander around a little bit. What I thought I was talking about was just what I thought of the Perl Paradox, which is literally nobody talks about Perl. I hadn't heard about it. I hadn't gone looking for it, but I hadn't heard about it, whereas I had heard about Haskell, say, in the last 10 years. I hadn't really heard about Perl. But looking at our customers and other people in the world, it's clear that everyone depends on Perl. And it got me really wondering, what's going on here? Why is it that a language everyone depends on is basically invisible? And less than invisible. Sometimes, frequently, over the last few years especially, when people have talked about Perl, they've talked about it in fairly negative terms, as if it was this legacy edifice that was impressive and amazing and ancient, but not really lively and active and interesting, which is not at all what I was seeing. That's a quote from Fast Company in 2014. Now, and it is stated in this weird way that prognosticators in the press tend to state things, which is basically, if the cause of X happens, then X might happen, if you read that quote carefully, which looks very prescient if X actually happens and can be shrugged off if X doesn't happen. I'm going to talk a little bit about committing to your beliefs in a bit. One of the fun things about working at Active State is I get to talk to Gartner analysts who are incredibly smart people and have a ridiculously deep knowledge of the fields that they study. I'm amazed by the information that they can bring back to us. And when we talk to them about Perl, they literally say no one talks to them about Perl. That it's been years since anyone has come to them and asked, for instance, a typical question they might get is, I'm starting this new project. Should I use one of these 2 or 3 languages? Perl doesn't come up in those conversations, apparently. I think there's reasons for that aren't as bad as some might infer. On the other hand, I'm sure you've all seen Perl is back in the top 10, which is kind of exciting. You can argue about whether or not the TIOBE rankings are the best possible measure of language popularity. You can argue whether or not, as a skeptical physicist, I would be apt to say that line looks kind of flat and I need a few more years of data before I'm convinced that it's rising. But this is not the only data we have. There's other information that I'll be talking about because, for example, the big thing that I saw inside of Active State almost immediately is our Perl business is large and growing. And there's no way that's consistent with what everybody or many people out there are saying about Perl. How can this be? And when we talk to our customers directly, we get this kind of feedback, that they're using more Perl, that companies that they're working with are using Perl, that various internal groups doing more and more sophisticated things are using Perl. And this figure of 10,000 jobs has actually come up. That specific number has come up a couple of times, talking to completely different customers in completely different industries on opposite sides of the Atlantic, where they say, yeah, we have 10,000 production jobs running, scripts, automation, what have you, that are handling moving data around inside our business, all of which are written in Perl. So there's something interesting going on there. There is also the famous Gartner market clock, and I was unfortunately not able to find a version of this from 2013, but I have heard a rumor that they'd actually pushed Perl into obsolescence and then brought it back. I can't confirm that, but I have heard that. The display here shows the maturity of a technology around the circumference, although slightly weirdly, the zenith is at the bottom, which I presume is what happens when an MBA uses an astronomical metaphor. And the radial axis, the radial dimension is the degree of commercialization or industrialization. And you'll see that Perl is sitting over there. It's in pretty good company with C. They pushed Fortran past the threshold of obsolescence, although my friends who do computational fluid dynamics might argue vigorously to the contrary. I don't think any of us are ever likely to fly in an aircraft that doesn't have some Fortran in the design. The other thing that I've added to the clock is a fork. Not the source code repo fork, but the table utensil. We think of technology as something that grows, matures, and then dies. And we have reasons for that. We've seen a lot of that in the last 30, 40, even 50 years. New technology that becomes mature, the VHS that is everywhere and then it disappears. This is actually pretty atypical. Forks were introduced as tableware, not as cookware, into the English-speaking world in the early 1600s. And they were controversial. They were talked about. Apparently there were church people who condemned them because it was impious not to touch God's food with your hands. But they didn't go away. They didn't become obsolete. Forks are everywhere, but nobody talks about them, just like Perl. And I think there are differences, but it's something to keep in mind that I think we have a very strong bias toward the new, toward the novel, and an implicit assumption that anything which is not new, novel, and growing in technology is going away and dying. And I don't think that's the case at all. I expect that people will be writing C long after I am gone and turned to dust. I don't think it is a language that solves the problem it was meant to solve extraordinarily well. It will be very hard to replace, and I think there's a similar argument to be made for Perl. So I asked myself, and more to the point, I asked the marketing people, what's going on? Explain this to me. I'm just a dumb technology guy. You tell me what's going on out in the market. And they answered me. We have over 100,000 downloads of Active Perl every month. And we ask people for their email addresses, and some small fraction of them, a few percent, actually give them to us. Good email addresses, not f@u.com. Out of the numbers, so we sent out 18,000 surveys to ask people a bunch of questions about what they're doing with Perl. And we got 350 odd responses back, it's a 2% response rate. So we're talking about 0.4% maybe of our total population here. Nonetheless, I'm going to argue, going to put some scientific purity behind me, that we can look at these data and possibly draw some interesting conclusions about what's going on in the Perl market. One of the interesting things is that we have enough responses, about 100 people who are using Perl in commercial uses versus 200 odd that are using it as individuals, to split those out and analyze them separately, and we'll see some patterns in the data that suggest there's some legitimacy in inferring things from this. And the kind of questions we ask, this is not the complete set, but what version platform are you running? How long have you been doing this? What industry are you in? What are you doing with it? And for us particularly, how come Active Perl and not something else? So I'm going to give a little Bayesian interlude because I am a committed Bayesian. A lot of the work in the 90s on hard statistical problems led us toward Bayesian style inference because it lets us fold in prior beliefs in a natural and controllable way. And the important thing about Bayesian reasoning, there are a couple of important things. One is that certainty is off the table. I personally believe that certainty was a mistake. I liken it to alchemists' search for the philosopher's stone. They did all this interesting stuff, but they were solving the wrong problem. They were searching for something that would turn base metals into gold, which we know basically can't be done. Philosophers spent thousands of years searching for certainty, and I think there are arguments why that's a bad goal, even though they did lots of interesting stuff. What Bayesians are interested in is what's more plausible and what's less plausible. And one of the nice things about that is that it makes arguments much more continuous rather than binary, and you can start to see and value and get value out of diverse points of view. The fundamental thing that the Bayes theorem runs on the idea that rare events that would be made less rare if something was true constitute good evidence for that thing being true, or more plausible, at least. That's the fundamental thing that drives it. And I like, when I'm even doing an informal analysis, to commit myself to a favorite hypothesis, to ask myself up front, what do I really believe? And that forces me to confront the data in a particular way, where if I have a bunch of things that I believe that are contradicted by the data, I can't say, oh yeah, well that was obvious, because I've already committed myself. It's in writing. There's a good book by this guy Duncan Watts called Everything is Obvious. In the subtitle is Once You Know the Answer. And he's talking fundamentally about how we convince ourselves that things are obvious after we know the data. Curiously, we're lousy at predicting what the data should be beforehand, which if things were genuinely obvious, they'd be predictable. They aren't. So I held myself to account, and I wrote down what I thought, and to an extent what we thought within the company was what we expected the survey results to be, based on our hypotheses about the language. We expected it would be mostly Windows, because we're a Perl on Windows company, and Perl ships with Linux. Why would they use ours? We thought older versions, I certainly thought older versions would predominate, because I was thinking about Perl as a legacy language used in legacy systems. Why would people be upgrading when they're running old code? Likewise, I was expecting Perl devs, they're going to get old. The more, the longer we back go, the further, more experience we get, we're going to see this ramp up. We're not going to see new, young Perl devs because it's a legacy language. Little did I know. I expected most use would be in software and IT rather than non-software industries because it's a hardcore language. Programmers are going to be using it, not non-programmers, not engineers, analysts, people like this. And I was expecting Perl was going to be web-related. And you can probably tell, looking at this, that I didn't know very much. And I learned. We saw a lot of Linux in the responses, and I'm still not sure why this is. Part of it may be we ship exactly the same stuff on multiple platforms, and we do know from our commercial customers that people like that. They like to be able to run exactly the same thing on Windows, on Linux, on Solaris, or whatever combination they're running. So they're never chasing bugs because, oh, we're using a different version of some module here rather than there. But we need to dig more deeply into that. I'm going to show graphs of this in a bit, but I like to look at the raw numbers first because it gets a little complicated. We do see older versions are bumping up into close to the double digits. Then there's this lull in the middle, and then usage ramps up with later versions quite dramatically. And the years of experience are probably the most startling thing in the data. And again, this is 0.4% of our total, there's several million downloads over this. We got 350 people. Nonetheless, we are seeing almost half, well, more than half the developers in the individual users who have been using Perl for less than 3 years. And about a third in the commercial users who have been using Perl for less than 3 years. These are new people coming to the language. They aren't necessarily young people, but they're developers who have come to Perl and started using Perl in the last 3 years. Weirdly, because the survey was designed by marketing people, we somehow left out the 4-year mark. We'll do better. We'll do better next time. So there are no. I don't know what people did if they were using the language for 4 years. They may have answered various ways. We do see a lot of older Perl devs, especially, and you'll notice this is one of the patterns. There's more people in the commercial world who have more experience than in individual users, which is one of the things you would expect. So that does help validate that there's something interesting going on here in terms of experience. So this is all those tables summed up in a single graph. The turquoise is individual users, the green is corporate users. I probably could have chosen more different colors. The interesting thing to me is this is the x-axis here is the year a particular version of Perl was released. And as you can see, as we know, there were some big gaps in the release schedule between 2000 and 2010. And we do see, other than the 5.10 release, which is a bit of a blip, but we basically see a decline in the version that people are using in that period. And then, in 2010, the Perl community, to its great credit, started producing yearly releases with a regular cadence, new features, bug fixes, the whole bit, and we see this strong, powerful ramp up in adoption. And again, we see individual users have a steeper curve than the corporate users, which is what you would expect. Individuals are tending to upgrade more quickly. This is small, medium business use. Typically, they're hanging back a little bit. And if we add our enterprise users, which are large enterprises, this is a different data set folded in, you can see the peak is at 516. That number actually goes up to 30%. So our large enterprises, as you would expect, are hanging back even more. I would love to know why, what, how the people who are using 5.10, 5.6 and 5.8 rather, are doing. What is keeping them on those versions of the language? And that's something we'll be looking at later as well, because undoubtedly the world would be a better place if those people could be shepherded forward to a more modern version of Perl. So that's the core of my story. That curve is a Perl Renaissance, which I will come back to. Nonetheless, we also asked, where are people using this language? And we saw a lot in software, but as you can see, more than half is in non-software related industries. We knew that there was a lot in finance and some in healthcare and government. Telecoms and semiconductors were surprises to us. We weren't aware we were getting that much uptake there. We get a lot of Tickle use there because Tickle gets used to drive command tools in some electronic design processes. But there's a lot of Perl being used there as well. And of course, somebody is using it for beer, which can only be a good thing. Likewise, when I was expecting everything would be, or at least it would be dominated by web use, this turns out not to be the case. General scripting, data transformation were the absolutely dominant uses of Perl throughout the enterprise. Web is 7% overall. So what people are using Perl for is fundamentally a general purpose scripting language optimized for data transformation. That was a surprise. Perl has become the duct tape of the enterprise. It's throughout small, medium, and large enterprises. And this is a word cloud of what individuals are using it for. And you can see a lot of data processing, text, parsing, there's some bioinformatics up at the top, manipulation, scripting applications, all general programming tasks. Web is on here someplace, but I don't think it's big enough to see. Corporate uses, data processing, analysis, scripting, scripts. Web there you can see, people are still driving websites with Perl, which is not a bad thing, but it's by no means the dominant use of the language in the enterprise. Just a lot of general purpose processing and transformation. And we wanted to know, why are you using Active Perl? Windows does loom large, ease of installation looms large. This is for individuals. And for corporations, support is a big thing. Having one company that supports this language on Windows matters to some people. That if you're running a large enterprise where you have mission critical processes that are depending on a language, you want to be able to pick up the phone, you want to be able to email, and you want to be able to get help. So that was gratifying to us. It made us feel we were providing some value for the world. Resolution of the paradox of why nobody talks about Perl, even though everyone depends on it, is there really was this lull in Perl adoption 3 to 5 years ago. That was a real phenomenon. And the yearly release cadence, the new features, the backporting of features from Perl 6, the vigor and vitality of the community have absolutely turned that around. So today, Perl is ubiquitous in the back rooms of the enterprise. People are using it, and the reason why nobody is going to Gartner and asking, should I use Perl in this project, is because if you were to build an automobile, you wouldn't go and ask an expert, should it have 4 wheels? You don't ask if you need to use Perl or you should use Perl because you know it's the right tool for the job. We don't talk about decisions that are easy. And Perl is easy. It's easy to decide to use it, and it's easy to use once you have decided to use it. That's fundamentally, I think, the story that these data are telling us. So this is kind of a summary done by the marketing people, so it's prettier. Almost half of developers have 3 years or fewer experience with Perl, which is just an amazing statistic. People are out there learning the language today. We're adopting new members into the community. And we have kind of 3 ages of Perl. We have a classical antiquity back in the 90s. We had a bit of a lull in the Middle Ages, and we are now very much in the middle of a Perl Renaissance. And that is the conversation that Active State wants to be part of. We have a language with speed, power, flexibility, ease of use, comprehensiveness. Back in my Perl days, I did things like solve ODEs in Perl. Why? Because I could just pull an ODE solver off of CPAN and it worked. I didn't have to think about it. Was it the fastest thing in the world? No, but it just worked. And CPAN, as we all know, has expanded enormously since then. It's become easier to use. There's better infrastructure. It's easier to find things. Testing is more comprehensive. And I feel foolish. I drifted away from Perl 10 years ago. And I think a lot of people out there are like me. And we just haven't thought about the language since. So I'm very excited about the possibilities of engaging with people like me, lapsed Perl people, and bringing them back and showing them how amazing Perl has become and how much more amazing it will become in the future. And that's what I have. And we have time, so feel free to ask questions, make comments, throw stones. Yes?
Your data that you base this on
Yep.
is fairly self-selecting.
Yes.
As you acknowledge.
Yep.
Do you have any, by being selected by those who, A, downloaded the software, B, filled out your forms, do you think there's any problem with drawing conclusions about software development public at large versus...
Yeah, it's certainly possible. Given how sparse the sample is, sure. As I said, there are patterns in the data that make me think, yeah, there's something here. It's hard to make the case that less than 1% overall that have gone through 2 different filters are going to be, hugely necessarily representative. But when you really undersample things and you just get noise, and you've got a correlation, you've got self-selection going on, it typically comes out in the data. You can typically see things in the analysis that are in the data that are affected by that, that give you reason to doubt it. I haven't seen that in these data. I've run various tests. It doesn't mean that they aren't there and I'm just missing them. But until I'm contradicted, I'm going to remain hopeful. And we are looking at, following up on this now. We're talking with our enterprise customers in a lot of detail, and a lot of the things we're hearing in those conversations confirm this. When a company tells you, we see new developers coming to the language. When a company tells you they're increasing their adoption of Perl, well, they're going to have to hire more Perl developers, which is going to bring new developers into the language. So there's a lot of ancillary information that I think tends to make the idea that we're undergoing a Perl Renaissance more plausible.
I was just asking because the big filter you're working with is folks who are your customers, whereas obviously was at Gartner with the IT world at large.
Yep.
So
We're selling to most of the Fortune 1000. So we're selling to most of the people that Gartner's talking to. So there's a considerable overlap between those groups. Yep.
Has Active State conducted similar studies amongst its users of Active Python? That would be part A. And part B is, do you have any way of comparing the Active Perl, Active Python results to other languages that have become fashionable in recent years, such as Scala and Go?
Yeah, the answer is basically no to both. We have not dug into the active Python customers. Python is a smaller part of our business, so this is where we focus our efforts initially on Perl. And getting real data on languages like Scala and Go, figuring out adoption curves, is extraordinarily challenging. We're fortunate that our customers will generally talk to us, but even that can be a challenge because you talk to a bank, for example, they don't really want to give you too much information about what they're doing. And that's absolutely as it should be, but it does make it difficult for us to determine what their internal adoption rates for various languages really are. Yeah. Yep.
So back to the by platform breakdown, I would assume that you might be able to track, for instance, the number of downloads by platform. I was curious if you
Would assume that. We're working on improving our internal data capture a lot. There was the center of gravity of the company during the staccato years very much shifted toward that part of the enterprise. And it did mean that a lot of the things you would think we were doing, we maybe haven't been doing as well as we would like in the last 3 to 5 years. And part of my mandate is to make all of that better. And now that we're through the transition period, we're running on all cylinders, we're very much focused on asking questions of that kind. We do, in fact. Well, one of the things I've done actually is insisted that all scripting in the company be in Perl. And because I think we don't want a proliferation of languages in the company. We don't want, I've been in places where we've had half a dozen scripts written in half a dozen languages, and when the guy who knows, awk, for example, leaves, well then somebody has to decipher it. So why not do it in Perl in the first place? Yes?
Okay, so Komodo is in Python, isn't it?
Pardon me?
Komodo, the editor?
Komodo is in Python. Yeah, so that and JavaScript.
Okay, but my initial question is, back in the days where Ruby was a big hype, I looked closely into Ruby, and I discovered that for 90% of the genome, it was footstep by footstep a copy of Perl with a nice syntax.
Yeah.
Plus some goodies from, I forgot the language, this object-oriented language, Smalltalk.
Right.
Then I read the book 7 Languages in 7 Weeks, and it praised a lot of features of Ruby, which were actually from Perl.
Sure.
So Ruby felt like a rebranding of Perl.
Yep.
And I have the impression that people are, they believe in life cycles and they want the new kid on the block.
Yep.
So my theory is what Perl needs, and okay, this will cause a little bit of controversy because we are in a deadlock because of Perl 6, because the number 6 is blocked. It's a rebranding.
Right.
I think if we would release a new Perl 5 version with some new nice features like opinionated formatting, like in Python as a feature, and rename it from Perl to Diamond, it will be rebranding.
That's possible, although I would argue that the modern Perl movement is a good piece of marketing to coalesce around. Because modern Perl is not Perl as I learned it. Modern Perl has got all these cool things that either weren't there or we weren't doing back in the day. So I do think that there are opportunities, modern Perl, the Perl Renaissance, there are various things we can do to convince people, which should be easy because it's true, that Perl is a modern, dynamic, first-class programming language that they should be paying attention to.
So you don't think that the rebranding is...
I think that...
It's too late. Perl 6 should have been called something else.
Yeah, I think given the facts on the ground, what we should be focusing on is talking about modern Perl, talking about the Perl Renaissance, talking about the cool and amazing things that people are actually doing in the enterprise today from our perspective, and on the desktop, and in the scientific community. There's incredible things going on, and we should just not be shy about celebrating those things.
Perl is the scientific community. When I look at my old university, it's predominantly Python.
Yep, you see a lot of Python in academia, no doubt about that. And one of the problems is that the kind of people who are using Perl are large enterprises, banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, who don't talk about what they're doing. So it's up to us, I think, to advocate for the language to promote the things that we know that are going on in the back rooms of large enterprises, without naming names, that Perl is doing. Yes?
On that note, I mean, how do you think that we can get into like academia, or is that something that you would want to?
Sorry, say again?
Do you think that we can get the Perl community, the Perl language back into
Back in academia. It's an interesting question. So the question was, is there a way of getting the Perl language back into academia? The short answer is I don't know. It would be cool if more people in academia were learning, if students were learning Perl in the classroom. I myself, I'm a physicist. I took one Fortran for Engineers course in 1980 or 81. That's my entire formal education in computing. And some of the best developers I know in all kinds of languages have not learned, through a computing science degree or similar. So while it would be cool and it would be nice, I'm not sure how fundamental it is. Let me ask, of the people in the room, how many here took a Perl course in university? 1, 2. So we're doing pretty well without the academics. And if, they'll catch up to us eventually. Yes?
So I actually taught Perl at the college level, and it was a struggle every year to get the 5 minimum students
Right.
to sign up for it.
Right.
Posted flyers on
Yep.
this language work, but
Yep.
just nobody signed up.
But those 5 students are very in demand today.
Probably all well employed.
Yep. And the people who didn't take it wish they did. And we'll get that message across eventually. Yes?
I'm just a little concerned. I want this to be true. Don't
Yeah.
get me wrong.
So would I. I have no confirmation bias at all.
I'm a little concerned because, like you were saying, some of the space you were sharing on was it the Gartner market?
Yep.
Radio thing was C and
Yeah.
Java. There's also COBOL up there, very close.
There is. Yep.
And there's a language that has been dying since I was a young programmer myself.
Indeed, but maybe COBOL is another fork. Maybe COBOL will be with us forever.
Yeah.
This belief we have that there's this natural growth and decay of languages, I think, is one that we really have to challenge ourselves on. And we just haven't had enough time to see it play out because programming is such a young discipline. But I think it's quite possible that syntax doesn't decay, that these languages will be with us potentially for a very long time. Yes?
The notion of the life cycle, the ascendance and decline, well, at one level that's true in terms of market share, because all computing languages must sum up to 100% market share.
Yes.
So that whatever is popular at one period of time,
Yep.
its market share must eventually decline, which is a completely separate question from its degree of use or usefulness.
Yeah, in the sense there are more languages. On the other hand, the newbies, the Rubies of the world, say, there are languages that pop up and come down again. The Cs, the COBOLs, the Fortrans, the Perls are at this steady level. And they may be growing, but they're ubiquitous and they're not going away. So there is, I think, a space at the top where or maybe at the bottom, where these foundational languages live. And there's competition for the space above them in the transient languages. And some of those languages may succeed and may ultimately replace one of the foundational languages, but we haven't seen that happen even with COBOL, even with Fortran, right? The first compiled language is still with us. We have 1 minute left, so time for one more question.
We don't want Perl to be a fad language. The rebranding is rperl.org and perl11.org, and the answer to get Perl back into academia is to have a super duper fast version of Perl that can be used for scientific purposes.
That's one way to do it.
That is one way to do it. Yep, not a bad idea at all. Yes?
What I hear quite often is that the Perl market is growing, but not as fast as the general market.
That I can't speak to because I haven't measured the general market. Even then, I'm not sure it's a bad thing. If we grow in absolute numbers, that's a good thing, even if other things are growing faster. And that's something that will vary over time. There will be times, and I think we may be entering one, where Perl is growing faster than most things. There'll be other times where we slow down, and that's natural for any technology. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm